Pomegranate. 1. Masako did not dislike her husband from the beginning. Nor could it be said that their marriage ended in failure because of any fault of his. The misfortune, I believe, lay in the sad nature of Shōzō and the youth of Masako, who could not understand that nature. The Matsumuro family had fallen from the position of Churo, middle-ranking official, during the era of Chōzō, and had further declined to the rank of Hirakata, lower-ranking official, during the time of his son, Itayu. Chōzō's fall was due to his violent temper, leading to an incident of assault, and Itayu's was a result of his reckless drinking. It is rare for a family to fall so far from such high ranks to such low ones in just 2 generations. Shōzō was born in the residence under the Yagora watchtower, during the time when his grandfather was still a churo, spent his childhood in a small house in Kukenmachi, and from the age of 11, grew up in a communal house in the Umiya, horse stable, district. It goes without saying that the environment of such a fall, in an era where class distinctions were rigid, would have had a profound effect on the young boy's character. Moreover, it is likely that he inherited the fragile bloodline of his grandfather and father, making misfortune seem almost inevitable. Masako's family, the Inuma family, had long been in positions of rank and responsibility, with her father, Genba, serving as a spear officer in the military. She had 2 older brothers, Shinichiro and Jinjiro, and as the youngest daughter, she was raised under the strict discipline of her father, resulting in a somewhat rigid and inflexible upbringing, quite different from the broader society. Her engagement to Matsumuro had begun through the mediation of the middle-ranking official, Tozawa Kazumo, and although her father had some reservations, the marriage was eventually arranged due to a sort of guarantee from Tozawa, who promised to look after Matsumuro's future. Of course, this was information she learned after the marriage had ended in misfortune, and it is not meant to shift the blame onto Tozawa. Masako, at that time, was more captivated by the beauty of the clothes and hair accessories that were to be made for her than by the reality of marriage itself. At 17, this child, her mother would often say, underscoring just how young she was. The wedding ceremony took place in August, only about 30 days after the arrangement was made. The sadness of parting with her parents and brothers, of leaving her childhood home, was stronger than the feeling of marrying into another family. Just before leaving, she sneaked into the garden and cried bitterly by the amaranth flowers, their leaves beginning to turn color. She quickly wiped away her tears before anyone could see and returned to her room. The memory of the color of those amaranth leaves and the untainted taste of the tears she shed while looking at them would remain with Masako for a long time, though she would never know just how deeply she would come to yearn for that moment. The new life was a shock to Masako. Far more naive than her age would suggest, she became shockingly frail within a few days, overwhelmed by fear, pain, and insomnia. Matsumuro had a sickly mother-in-law, who was a quiet woman and had been withdrawn for about 2 years. It seemed that she noticed Masako's state, for she began to speak with her about various things, in a subtle way. This helped alleviate the confusion and terror Masako had felt, but one phrase in particular stayed deeply etched in her mind, because it is a woman's duty. No matter how delicious something may be, when it becomes a duty to consume it, the appetite fades. For Masako, who was still too young both mentally and physically, the overwhelming sense of duty, which replaced her fear, became a new source of pain, leading to an uncontrollable feeling of repulsion. If Shōzō had had a slightly different personality, perhaps their marriage could have been salvaged. However, even at the age of 24, he was naive about the world. His sense of inferiority due to his family's decline made him overestimate the significance of the marriage, and this seems to have intensified his feelings of love for Masako, making them extreme and singular. "Masako, do you hate me?" he would often say, grabbing her hands. "Can't you understand how much I love you? Be honest with me. Can you really never love me?" "I won't stay a low-ranking official forever," he would say when he had drunk just a little, raising his shoulders. "I'll restore the Matsumuro family. It's not a big deal. Just wait, Masako. I'll make you the wife of a churro. I'll make sure you live a life that won't bring shame when we go out into society. I swear I'll make sure you never have to be ashamed of anything." As long as they were at home, Shōzō never let go of Masako for a moment. If they were near each other, he would constantly hold her hand or drape his arm around her shoulder. He would always gaze at her, sometimes turning pale or sighing, saying, "How beautiful you are." Then, almost every few days, he would bring home something. He would buy extravagant, sensual clothes, sashes, hairpins, combs, hand mirrors, book covers, and various accessories. Masako tried her best to show appreciation, for there were indeed some things that made her happy. But deep inside, there was an emotional discord that prevented her from expressing joy in a sincere way. Even without that, the way Shōzō expressed his affection was not something Masako, who had been raised with strict discipline, found pleasant. The life of a samurai was often full of actions that seemed shameful, especially in comparison to the life she had been taught was proper. This only pushed her further away from her husband. Shortly after Masako's marriage, Shōzō was looking at a ripe pomegranate, splitting it open and gazing at the fruit. Suddenly, with a look in his eyes that seemed feverish, he turned to Masako, pointing to the red seeds inside the fruit, and said, "Look at this beautiful fruit. To me, it looks just like your body." 2. From the split skin of the fruit, separated by white membranes, these clear, fresh, pulpy seeds appear. As I look at the beautiful redness, which seems like the blood of a maiden's purest innocence that has been sucked in, I begin to feel as though I am looking into your body. At that moment, Masako felt a terror so close to shame that it was as if her body had been split open and her inner self exposed. The sense of revulsion and humiliation was indescribable, and from that point onward, whenever Shōzō looked at her, she felt a chilling unease. Shōzō became more nervous and irritable. At times, he would become frighteningly angry, refusing to speak or come near her. He would call loudly from the living room, and when she hurried to him, he would dismiss her with a curt, "It's over, good," as though pushing her away. However, this never lasted long. Soon, he would pull her close again, apologize, and, full of regret, repeat his passionate affections. "It's just a little longer. I'll definitely succeed," he would swear, holding his wife's tightly hunched shoulders, his tone filled with resolve. "We'll soon say goodbye to this miserable life. As long as you're my wife, I'll do anything. Anything at all. I've already found a way out." In October, his mother passed away from illness. It was a quiet death, as if the frost was slowly melting away. In her final moments, she looked deeply at Shōzō, who was sitting at her bedside. Then her gaze shifted to Masako, and after staring at her for a while, she slowly closed her eyes. To Masako, it felt as though there was something she wanted to say, but knowing it would be in vain, the gaze seemed to communicate this unspoken meaning. Shōzō cried inconsolably, but his tears seemed less to show deep affection and more to highlight the fragility of his emotions and his weak nerves. For Masako, it was a feeling that made her want to turn away. In early February, after the new year, the matchmaker, Tozawa Kazumon, suddenly visited. It seemed he was on his way out of the castle, and standing at the entrance in his formal attire, he asked, "Has Matsumuro returned?" After a brief pause, he added, "Then, when he does return, have him come to my house immediately," and left without entering further. Shōzō did not return. Masako waited without having dinner. She put the maid to bed at midnight, hesitated several times, and finally, after hearing the bell at 2 a.m., she crawled into bed herself, still in her day clothes. When she woke to the sound of the maid opening the kitchen door, the night had already passed. She immediately rose and quietly went to her husband's room, but of course, there was no sign of him, and there was no indication that he had returned. What could have happened? She murmured, anxiety beginning to creep in. When she stepped into the hallway, her eyes were drawn to a letter placed there. Masako froze, as if she had found something dangerous, staring at it with wide, fearful eyes for a few moments before quickly picking it up. She then hurried to her room, as though fearing someone might see, and sat down. It was a letter from Shōzō addressed to her, a confession and an apology. The letter began, "You will probably understand what I have done, so I won't write about it here." He explained that he had tried to restore the Matsumuro family to its former position, but more than for the sake of family name or his own advancement, it was because he wanted to make Masako the wife of a churro, so that she could live a prosperous life, both materially and spiritually. He had no other ambition than to make her happy. He begged her to believe this. "I failed terribly. I was so anxious that I became blinded, and made an irreversible mistake. Perhaps this is the fate that the Matsumuro family was always meant to follow. I will leave the country and deal with my affairs. I have nothing to apologize for to you, Masako. I will leave without asking for your forgiveness, but I hope that you will be happy in the future. I truly regret the misfortune you've encountered. Please, I hope you can recover from this as soon as possible." The letter conveyed these sentiments in roughly these words. Masako immediately burned the letter. At that moment, she felt a surge of anger at the pitiful words of a samurai who had ruined himself in an attempt to make his wife happy. In contrast, there was a sense of relief, as though she were freed from a heavy burden. The sorrowful tone in the short letter, encapsulated in its brief lines, did not even register in her mind. After finishing breakfast, Masako quickly changed her clothes and went to visit the Tozawa family's residence. Kazumon listened to part of her story before hurriedly calling his retainers to make arrangements for the pursuit. "Send men on horseback to both highways. They may try to cross the mountains using the snow. Also, send men to Hoshidarizawa," Kazumon said in an urgent tone. "We cannot let him escape. Do everything you can." Masako stayed there as Tozawa's retainers went out with a maid to the empty house. Shōzō was not caught. Later, it was learned that at the time, he had been hiding at a family temple, waiting for the pursuit to slacken before escaping across the border. The details were unclear, but the crime was said to be the embezzlement of a large sum of public funds. Masako stayed at the Tozawa household for about 6 months, receiving their care during that time. 3. Shōzō was condemned to death by beheading while still in flight, and the Matsumuro family name was extinguished. Naturally, his wife would have been subject to punishment as well. However, due to the responsibility of the matchmaker, Tozawa, who likely intervened, she was secretly moved to the Edo residence in September of that year, with the excuse of no interference from the home country. In Edo, she settled into the house of her maternal uncle, Onoki Shōzō, and eventually began working in the service of the court. Initially, she served under the former lord's mother, Shōzō, but after 5 years, she was promoted to the rank of Churokaku, becoming a secretary. Her stipend consisted of 15 ryo of rice, 7 ryo 2 bu in cash, monthly provisions of 6 kon 4 bu of firewood, 2 bales of charcoal 8 bu, 8 go of oil, 2 sho 8 go of bran, and 30 mon of vegetable money, which allowed her to employ 3 children. 6 years later, at the age of 28, she took on a position as a gatekeeper, and by the time she was 35, she had become an old woman in the service. Up until this point, her life had been relatively peaceful and bright. Though it was an all-female environment, she was sometimes bothered by trivial slanders, jealousy, or gossip. Some women enjoyed indulging in inappropriate topics or had bad habits, and she often experienced the distasteful and unpleasant side of being a woman. However, apart from the younger women, many of those over 20 had decided to remain single for various reasons, and there was a sense of independence and self-awareness among them. Compared to her life in Matsumuro, this new life was far more comfortable, and she could live with a sense of freedom and relaxation. Thinking about the hardships of marriage, this really is a woman's heaven, they often said. Just the thought of having to placate a difficult husband, or being scared of the constant nagging from a father-in-law and mother-in-law, and spending all my time doing household chores without a break, it's enough to make me shudder. Getting married, as a woman, is basically giving your life away to someone else. These were the kinds of conversations she often had. However, around the time she turned 35, a gradual change began to take place in Masako's heart. It started when the daughter of her eldest brother came to marry in Edo. The niece, named Sanae, was 18 years old, and her husband was Watanabe Daisuchi, a storage official. Masako was invited to their wedding, which led to her becoming more involved with the extended family, who also lived in the same house. This shift in her social interactions was partly due to her status as an older woman who had some free time from work, as well as her age, now 35. A previously distant relative, Sugihara from her maternal side, became especially close, and sometimes Masako was even consulted about domestic matters. It was when Sugihara's wife fell ill that things started to change. When Masako visited her to offer her condolences, she often saw her husband, Ibe, standing by the bedside. Whenever he had a moment, he would sit beside her, reading or conversing. Ibe was usually a stern, serious man, but at that time, he seemed anxious, unsettled, and overly concerned about his wife's condition. He would personally tend to her medicine and meals. "Men are really like children, aren't they?" remarked the wife, frowning. "He's completely flustered, thinking I might die. Despite saying he doesn't trust the doctor, he calls for them the moment my face looks a little pale. It's so embarrassing." Masako felt a strong urge to respond, but stopped herself. She wanted to say, "That's a sign of how deeply your husband loves you," but something caught in her throat, and she couldn't speak. For some reason, the words wouldn't come out. That night, for the first time, Masako reflected on her own married life. Her views on marriage had changed. She wasn't the same 17-year-old she had been when she first entered her marriage. Nearly 20 years had passed, and she had learned so much. The world, the hidden aspects of people's hearts, the facades that supported daily life, and the ugliness behind beauty. At 35, Masako understood things she hadn't before. "I was too young," she murmured, with a sharp, painful feeling in her chest. For the first time, she thought she understood the depth of the love with which Shōzō had acted, and how she had responded to it. From that moment, a new world opened in her heart. Whenever she visited someone, she would unconsciously observe the couple's relationship. Each time, she reflected on her own life with her husband. Despite sharing similar income, social status, and age, 5 different couples lived in 5 different ways. Some were distant, some affectionate, some ostentatious, and others modest. No 2 couples were alike. Yet, each one was deeply connected, supporting and caring for each other in their own way. From an outside perspective, both the husband and wife in each pair had their flaws, but it seemed that to the couple themselves, those flaws were not so apparent. This, Masako thought, was the truth. When a man becomes a husband, and a woman becomes a wife, even what might seem like flaws to others can be accepted. From a private understanding, known only to the 2 of them, love between husband and wife begins. Now, Masako recalled each expression of affection that Shōzō had shown her. They were all genuine in his own way. What had seemed excessive was merely the fact that his love was unique to him, unlike any other. The more genuine he had been, the more there could have been no other way to express it. What is this? Masako covered her face with her hands. What could this mean? 4. Masako also remembered the confession and apology letter that Shōzō had left when he fled. He had written that he wanted to make her happy and had no other ambitions. "Please believe this," was the heartfelt plea that lingered vaguely in her memory. At that time, she had thought it was a pitiful thing for a samurai to express, and immediately burned the letter. But now, with a clearer understanding, she realized that it was a deep and devoted love, which at the time had seemed pitiful and weak, but now shone with a profound truth. "I shouldn't have burned it. I shouldn't have. If I had read it now, I would have understood so much more, the truth of it all," she reflected. By the time she turned 40, Masako had become an elder at the highest rank of service in the inner court, receiving 30 koku of rice and 25 ryo of stipend. During this time, her perspective began to shift. She began to recognize that, while she bore responsibility for the failure of her marriage to Shōzō, there were many factors, such as the misfortune of the Matsumuro family, Shōzō's character shaped by those circumstances, and the complex web of surrounding events, that made their unhappiness inevitable. The more she accepted this as an inescapable fate, the more she regretted that, with just a little more wisdom and love, she might have been able to save Shōzō from his ruin. This regret stayed with her as a lasting sorrow. At the age of 52, Masako retired and returned to her homeland. She was granted a house in the town of Momoyama, located about 20 cho north of the castle town. The house was situated on a hillside on the southern slope, offering a view of the castle and part of the samurai district through a grove of red pines. The house had once belonged to a retired official, and though it was small with only a few rooms, it had a large garden of about 1,000 tsubo. The garden was filled with pine, cedar, maple, and cherry trees, arranged in a way that made them blend harmoniously, with subtle contrasts between the maples and pines. The garden featured carefully arranged shrubs and moss-covered stone lanterns placed unexpectedly in the underbrush, reflecting the sensitivity of its original owner. In Sato's Inuma, both her father and mother had passed away long ago, and her eldest brother had died 5 years earlier, leaving his son, Zenziman, to inherit the family. Their relationship was distant, and because of incompatible temperaments, she only visited them out of obligation. Other relatives, too, had changed with the generations, and there were hardly any whom she could visit with close familiarity. Her household consisted of 4 people, the elderly servant, Kanzo, and 2 maids. After about 30 days, the younger maid, who had been struggling with the solitude, commented, "Foxes appear around here during winter," she said, looking back with an almost wistful expression. That seemed plausible. The northern side of the property was slightly higher, dotted with samurai villas, and beyond that, the Hahashima Valley spread out with groves of pine and oak trees, extending into fields. When Masako was a child, there had even been stories of wolves appearing, and she had once been frightened when gathering matsutake mushrooms and shimji. "Then perhaps we should call it Kokoen, the fox-hearing hermitage," she had jokingly said to the maid, but even as she laughed, Masako couldn't help but feel a coldness settle on her shoulders. After living for over 30 years in the bustling quarters of the court, the initial feeling of loneliness in this quiet life was akin to being exiled. At first, it was a deep sense of isolation. At night, she would light 2 or 3 lamps, have in sleep in her room, and often, unable to sleep, sip on some wine during the late hours. One winter, a deer had wandered into the property. Masako was collecting plants in the pine forest when she heard the crunch of leaves underfoot. When she turned, she found herself face to face with a stag, nearly 9 feet tall, or so it appeared to her. Its reddish-brown fur, terrifying antlers, and glaring eyes all seemed to converge in a frightening display. She didn't remember this part, but she had apparently screamed in terror. By the time Kanzo had rushed over with a staff, the stag had managed to escape, scratching its antlers on the low branches of the forest before fleeing towards the area known as Tanakubo. "You should buy a rifle," the old servant said regretfully as he watched the stag escape. "What a shame." Masako, now thoroughly unsettled, had decided to surround the garden with a bamboo fence before the snow arrived. As the year was coming to a close, an elderly woman suddenly came to visit. "Do you recognize me?" she asked, laughing at the entrance. "I bet you don't." "Ah, it's Kiku from the Tozawa family," Masako exclaimed, almost like a daughter calling out. "Kiku, isn't it? My, what a surprise. Welcome, please come in." The visitor was the youngest daughter of Tozawa Suemon. She was 1 year younger than Masako, and they had become close when Masako stayed with the Tozawa family for about 6 months. Back then, Kiku was already engaged, and after Masako left for Edo, she had married. However, due to the changes in their circumstances, Masako had not thought of her at all since then. Kiku had married an elderly man, Okura Shoten, who had once held a government post, and now they lived in retirement. Masako felt as though she had met an old friend from 100 years ago and was overjoyed. She sent Kanzo to the house on an errand, and that night insisted on having Kiku stay with her. 5. Masako's life in Momoyama gradually settled into a natural rhythm. Following Kiku's visit, more guests began to come, and she hosted gatherings for haiku, tea, and occasional small banquets under the moonlight or amidst the falling snow. After 3 years, the maid left to take a break, and the younger servant, who had not quite settled in, followed soon after. Kanzo worked diligently, but due to gout, he left after 5 years and was replaced by a man named Isuke. Within the next couple of years, Kiku passed away, and several others who had frequently visited her, including some who had been transferred to Edo or died from illness, gradually disappeared from her circle. Masako herself also fell ill for about 3 months. It was during this time, as autumn was nearing its end, that one night, in the stillness of what seemed like the middle of the night, Masako suddenly awoke to the sound of a transverse flute coming from the garden. During her time in Edo's palace, Masako had studied music and could distinguish various tunes, but the melody she heard that night was unlike anything she had ever known. It was perhaps not even a melody in the traditional sense. It seemed more like a series of improvised notes, searching for a preferred sound. The tone was plain, flat, and in no way appealed to the emotions. The flute stopped soon after. Once Masako recovered, she invited a few guests to a small celebration. Afterward, as she was seeing them off in the garden, she suddenly stopped Isuke and asked, "Were you playing the flute?" The old servant seemed taken aback, bowing deeply and muttering that it was just a bit of mischief. Isuke had replaced Konzo 2 years prior, and though he always worked quietly, Masako had exchanged very few words with him. He was probably around 67 or 68 years old. Though he was thin, his frame was solid and sturdy, with an air of quiet dignity around his shoulders. He spoke very little, and whatever he did in a calm and composed manner. Masako thought he must have had some past, something that had caused him to fall from a different station in life. She did not press him at that time, but, a few days later, when she saw him sweeping the garden, she had him sit on the porch and offered him tea, inviting him to rest for a while. Isuke sat down to take off his sandals, quietly enjoying the tea, and gradually began to answer Masako's questions. "Yes, that's right. I was not born in this land." Isuke spoke quietly, his gaze drifting towards the distant pine forest, breaking his words into pauses. "If I were to say a word, it would be a disgrace to my past. My family was doing quite well. We had 3 storage houses, among other things. But as fate would have it, now there is not even a single foundation stone left if I were to return. Yes, it was far to the south." This conversation became the starting point for more frequent talks with Isuke. He was willing to speak about anything when asked, but his responses were always humble and indirect. Rather than directly discussing a subject, he would express it through a side note. For example, when speaking of the flute, he said, "My own playing is all over the place. But I did live with a group of local kagura performers for about 3 years, and among them, there was someone who could be called a master." He also spoke of having married once, though it did not go well, and he had no children. Since leaving his hometown, he had wandered from one town to the next, living a life of survival, enduring struggles that could not be spoken of. His life was like a dead leaf blown across the water's surface, carried along by the flow, living merely as circumstances dictated. The dead leaf was blown by the wind and ended up in an eddy, Isuke said with a quiet smile. "I suppose it was in just such a way that I ended up being taken care of here. Thanks to you, I am living a life of peace for the first time. I never dreamed I would be able to live such a quiet, free life." Despite becoming more familiar with each other, Isuke's manner remained unchanged. He showed no signs of familiarity or laziness. Unless Masako directly spoke to him, he would silently continue his work with steady diligence. If offered, he would drink alcohol, but he never sought it out on his own. One autumn, while walking through the forest, Masako found some ripening akbi, a type of fruit, growing high up on a vine. She attempted to reach it but couldn't, so she decided to call Isuke for help. He was probably chopping wood, and when Masako returned to find him, he was sitting on a wooden post in front of the shed, with his back to her. He was staring intently at something in his hands. The sour, woody scent of freshly split firewood filled the air around them. Curious, Masako quietly approached from the side and peered over his shoulder. What she saw was a ripe pomegranate resting in his palm. Surprised, she couldn't help but smile wryly. "Our pomegranates are too sour to eat," she said. Isuke was startled, practically leaping off the wooden post. The pomegranate slipped from his hand and rolled across the ground. "Oh, my heart just sank," he said, as he began to gather the akbi. He sighed heavily a few times, still shaken by the surprise. "I've never been so startled. I must have been half asleep." In all the 8 years that Isuke had lived with her, this was the first time he had shown such a visible, unguarded reaction. Masako also laughed heartily, and even later, whenever she thought about it, she couldn't help but smile at the memory. 6. About 10 days prior, Masako had decided to cut down the oak tree in the garden. The branches and canopy had grown too large and were obstructing her view of the moon. She had thought about it the previous year, but her hesitation had caused her to delay the task. When she mentioned it to Isuke, he immediately offered to do it for her. "If you don't mind, I can cut it down," he said, and promptly went to the castle town to buy an axe. The oak had a trunk circumference of about 5 feet. Isuke, working steadily, spent the entire first day swinging the axe. By the afternoon of the second day, he had cut about halfway through the trunk. After observing him, Masako returned to her room and sat at her desk to write a letter. The wife of a prominent merchant in the town, a close friend of the late Kiku, had been visiting frequently of late, and Masako planned to invite her to the following month's gathering. As she prepared the ink and brush, and began composing the letter, a strange thought suddenly emerged in her mind, one that she couldn't explain. She wondered if Isuke might be her late husband, Shōzō, in disguise. This peculiar suspicion rose with such intensity and certainty that it seemed to completely take over her thoughts. It was as if fragments of subconscious impressions accumulated over the past 8 years had, at this moment, come together to form a clear image. She muttered, "Ah," and placed her brush down, a sense of unease washing over her. At that moment, the sound of the oak tree falling with a tremendous crash echoed through the garden, and the ground trembled. Masako shuddered. The pomegranate. When she had first married into the Matsumuro family, Shōzō had cracked open a pomegranate and compared its beautiful seeds to the grains of his wife's body. Isuke, by the shed, had placed the same fruit in his palm and was gazing at it so intently that he seemed unaware of anyone approaching. The extreme shock he had shown earlier, could it have been merely a surprise due to absent-mindedness? Memories from the past 8 years surged up from Masako's subconscious, his gestures, the edges of his words, the expression on his face when he smiled, the way his eyes observed things, and again, the pomegranate. But what is happening? Masako thought, suddenly turning her gaze toward the garden. I can't hear anything. After the sound of the oak falling, everything is silent. Indeed, after the tremendous noise and the earth-shaking sound of the oak tree falling, an eerie silence had descended. Masako stood up and stepped out onto the veranda. The area across the garden had inexplicably brightened, and for the first time, the Tetsumi Tower of the castle could be seen clearly ahead. The oak tree had fallen toward the low slope, its fresh cut facing her. There were no sounds, no shadows of people. That unnerving quiet sent a chill through Masako. Something had happened. Something extraordinary had occurred. As this intuition gripped her, she rushed barefoot into the garden. Isuke was pinned beneath the oak tree. His pelvis had been crushed. His lips had turned as pale as paper, and he was gritting his teeth. Masako screamed, calling out the names of the maid and the chambermaid as she knelt beside him. The maid and chambermaid rushed to the scene, causing a commotion, which Masako quickly scolded them for. She sent one to fetch a doctor and instructed the other to bring 4 or 5 people. "Hold on," she said urgently. "People will be here soon. The doctor will come soon, too. Do you recognize me?" "Don't bother," Isuke whispered in a barely audible voice, his brows furrowed. "I'm getting old. I slipped." It was a foolish thing to do. Masako placed her hand on Isuke's shoulder and gazed intently into his eyes as she spoke. "Please tell me the truth. You are not Shōzō, are you? You are Matsumuro Shōzō, aren't you?" Isuke's mouth opened, his eyes widened. There was a fleeting sensation of something running through his large, wide-open eyes, like a flash of light. Masako gripped his shoulders with both hands, leaning her face close to his as she called out. "Please, tell me. Your injuries are severe. This may be the last time. Just one word of truth. You are my husband, aren't you?" Isuke stared silently at her. For a while, he looked up at her without speaking, but then he slowly shook his head from side to side. In a very faint voice, almost inaudible, he whispered, "I had a good life." Masako cancelled the invitation for the later banquet. After Isuke's body was buried in the corner of the garden, surrounded by shrubs and patches of sunlight, the shrike would often come and sing. But soon, snow arrived and covered everything in a blanket of white. Snow fell atop the frozen base layer, accumulating and then freezing again. Still, Masako did not stop visiting Isuke's grave, lost in thought in the quiet, secluded corner. Isuke had denied that he was Shōzō. This could be taken at face value, or it could be interpreted as an affirmation in the form of a denial. Masako, by now 63 years old, had reached an age where she understood not just words and appearances, but also the deeper truths hidden within the human heart. She must have known by then that she had remained single since that time. Isuke had once mentioned that he had been married, but that it didn't work out, and that since then, he had no wife or children. Whether Isuke was Shōzō or not, the last words he whispered were enough to bring Masako peace. "I had a good life,"